A tank roars to life, its steel shell vibrating with tension as the crew braces for battle. Inside, it's a furnace of fear and adrenaline. A deafening blast, the tank shudders, a ricochet, a near-miss, survival hangs by a thread. In the chaos of combat, camaraderie is forged in fire. But when the smoke clears, who will emerge from the steel coffin unscathed? During the Second World War, armored behemoths, tanks, prowled the battlegrounds of Europe, Africa, and Asia, emerging as one of the defining symbols of contemporary warfare. From 1939 to 1945, the globe bore witness to an unparalleled mobilization of armored machines, spanning from the Blitzkrieg assault on Poland to desert clashes in North Africa and the colossal confrontations involving thousands of tanks across the Eastern Front. Tanks demonstrated their decisive impact in numerous major operations, spawning an entirely fresh category of warriors, tank crews. These individuals, alongside a handful of women within Soviet army ranks, comprised the crews of these metallic giants and became the armored spearhead of their military forces. At first impression, tank operators might have appeared like contemporary knights clad in gleaming armor, safeguarded by heavy steel plating. Military propaganda frequently depicted them as fearless champions, surging into combat within their armored vehicles. Nevertheless, the truth of existence merely inches beyond the steel barrier proved far harsher and distant from idealistic concepts. What truly characterized service inside a tank throughout World War II? Tank operators confronted a relentless battle against mechanical challenges, physical discomfort, and omnipresent peril. Whether German panzer crews, Soviet operators in T-34s, or American and British soldiers manning Shermans, all shared comparable experiences, a blend of pride in their formidable weapon and hardship beneath its shadow. During the conflict, an estimated hundreds of thousands of warriors from all sides served within tank crews, countless among them heroically perishing in battle. Behind every advancing tank stood a team of individuals engaged in an equally fierce struggle within the machine, wrestling with terror and exhaustion. In this presentation, you will discover what tank operators encountered in their everyday existence. We shall examine rigorous preparation, conditions within cramped armored monsters, and dramatic, perilous moments during live combat. Soon, we will also unveil surprising details regarding crew life, such as how soldiers managed brewing tea amid desert conditions, or how they battled severe cold. Prepare for an exclusive glimpse behind tank battle scenes, from the tanker's own perspective. I would deeply value your support for this presentation with approval and channel subscription. Thank you. At war's beginning, numerous young men joined tank units envisioning adventure and distinction. Tank operators were occasionally likened to modern knights in steel armor. The massive machines substituted horses, granting crews elite standing. However, reality behind steel armor proved far more ordinary. A tank crew typically comprised 4 to 5 soldiers, each assigned specific duties. The tank commander determined direction, sought targets, and coordinated entire crew actions, frequently communicating via radio with other tanks. The gunner operated the primary weapon and had to rapidly aim and strike targets. Even amid battle chaos, the loader bore responsibility for reloading the cannon with heavy shells, an activity demanding considerable physical strength and coordination with the gunner. The driver, positioned at the hull's front, maneuvered the multi-ton machine across terrain, while the radio operator managed radio communications and usually operated a machine gun for infantry defense. These roles differed among armies. For instance, in Soviet T-34 tanks, the commander also functioned as gunner, since the crew consisted of merely 4 men, placing extraordinary burden upon the commander. Regardless of nationality, the crew had to operate as a well-coordinated machine. Teamwork meant survival. One incorrect move or hesitation could spell doom for the entire tank. Tank operators spent lengthy months together, forging powerful bonds among crew members. They were battle comrades who had to depend absolutely upon one another. Shortly, we shall observe how ordinary conscripts became trained tank specialists. They weren't infantry, but the concept of entering battle inside an armored vehicle attracted many young men. However, the path to tank forces usually proved challenging. Candidates had to pass strict selection processes and undergo intensive training. For example, the German tank corps, the Panzerwaffe, carefully selected new recruits. Emphasis was placed on technical competence, rapid decision-making, and physical endurance. Future tank operators had to master not only operating the heavy vehicle but also understand it technically. In training facilities, newcomers learned recognizing engine components, repairing malfunctions, and properly maintaining weapons. As one instruction motto in the Soviet manual for T-34 crews declared, tank lifespan depends on timely and careful maintenance. Therefore, every crew member had to be somewhat of a mechanic. Tank training was demanding and intensive. Recruits first underwent infantry drills and physical conditioning. They needed good fitness to handle combat fatigue and stress. This was followed by specialized instruction. Future drivers trained in off-road driving and obstacle navigation. Gunners learned accurately directing fire and estimating target distances. Loaders practiced quickest handling of heavy ammunition in cramped spaces. Instructors sometimes created artificial stress scenarios. For example, during shooting practice, they would play loud sounds or shake the tank to prepare soldiers for real battle confusion. In the British Army, tank models were even used to practice crew cooperation before newcomers took their first ride in an actual machine. Not everyone received lengthy preparation, especially at war's beginning. When armored vehicle losses grew rapidly, some crews were supplemented at accelerated pace. For example, Soviet tank operators in 1941 often completed only few courses before being sent to the front, and their first enemy encounter reflected that. Undertrained crews initially became easy prey for more experienced foes. Gradually, however, standards improved. Americans and British established extensive tank schools, such as Fort Knox in the USA and Bovington in the UK, where future commanders and crew members received theoretical knowledge and participated in simulated battles within training units. They also learned tactics such as coordinating with infantry, utilizing terrain for cover, or responding to various threats from enemy tanks to minefields. Training culminated in a final examination, where the crew had to demonstrate their cohesion in action. Sometimes this involved a night march with the tank or live firing at a training ground. Those who succeeded became certified tank operators and were sent to frontline units. However, there awaited them a completely new chapter of life. Shortly, we will examine what a typical day in a tank crew looked like when battle wasn't raging. Outside combat, tank operators' lives consisted of many hours of mundane routine, exhausting waiting, and endless work around the machine. Each day at the front began with technical inspections. The crew had to examine the engine, oil, tracks, and gun early in the morning. Only a perfectly prepared tank could enter action. According to military regulations, the tank was meant to become a second home for soldiers and a weapon requiring care. Soldiers often said they treated their tank as if it were a horse or family member. They loosened bolts, lubricated components, and cleaned gun barrels of soot and dust. If a tank had been stationary for extended periods, it was necessary to move the tracks to prevent them from seizing. And periodically, the engine had to be started. In addition to maintaining machinery, tank operators ensured camouflage and dug protective positions. When a unit stopped for extended periods, crews dug trenches around their tanks or concealed them under nets and branches to escape enemy observers or aircraft attention. They also made minor modifications. For example, they painted camouflage colors according to surrounding terrain, welded additional plates or track sections to the hull as makeshift armor, or attached sandbags to front plates. Such vehicle customization didn't always significantly increase protection, but it gave crews the sense that they had done everything possible for their safety. However, daily life wasn't only about tank work. Food and rest were important components. According to Army supply plans, field soldiers were supposed to have warm meals 3 times daily, which, however, was rarely realized on the front line. If the unit wasn't engaged in combat, field kitchens delivered stews, soups, or porridge directly to units. 2 to 3 times daily. In the rear of the Czechoslovak Tank Brigade in 1945, for example, a mobile bakery operated to supply tank operators with fresh bread. In battle chaos, however, soldiers often had no choice but to eat cold rations, crackers, or whatever they could carry in their pockets. For cases of being cut off, every tank carried what was called emergency rations inside, a 3-day food supply. Soldiers were allowed to use these provisions only on their officer's command, and often they didn't even need them, but they provided security. In their rare free moments, crews sought entertainment and tried to regain mental strength. They wrote letters home, played cards or dice, and when the situation allowed, they caught up on sleep. They usually slept outdoors next to their tanks or under tarps stretched from the hull. Inside the tank, they only rested in exceptional circumstances, such as bad weather or when there was attack threat. However, sleep quality was poor. The hard ground, cold nights, and constant readiness meant soldiers were chronically sleep-deprived. Hygiene took secondary importance. Several days without washing and sweaty uniforms were the norm, as battlefield conditions simply didn't allow for bathing. However, during longer pauses, commanders tried to secure field baths. For example, in Soviet unit rears, makeshift showers and sanitation stations operated. Soldiers stripped off, their uniforms underwent steam cleansing against lice, and they could finally wash with warm water after extended periods. Such a bath amid war was a real blessing and morale booster. Despite harsh conditions, tank operators found little joys and humor. Around common fires, they shared stories and sometimes even sang favorite songs. In British units, there was notorious passion for tea. Soldiers brewed strong tea at every opportunity to stave off fatigue. A joke even emerged that a British tank must stop whenever it was tea time. Improvisation knew no bounds. Water was heated on small stoves, or a pot of water was placed on the heated engine of the tank, which served as a stove. For Americans, favorite chewing gum or chocolate bars from rations were sources of pleasure, while Soviet tank operators often lit up machorka, strong homemade tobacco, and shared it among themselves. Occasionally, bizarre situations occurred. One Czechoslovak tank operator passed time in 1945 by trying to stun fish in the river with an explosion from a captured German grenade, hoping to gather an easy catch for dinner. However, the experiment ended tragically. The grenade exploded uncontrollably and the poor soldier lost his life. The brigade command then had to issue a strict ban on any unprofessional handling of captured ammunition. Such stories reminded everyone that even far from the enemy, war remained dangerous, and carelessness didn't pay off. Thus, tank operators' daily lives were filled with hard work, uncertainty, but also camaraderie and small joys. Every day in the field could be the last, so crews learned to appreciate moments of calm. In just a moment, we will take a look inside tanks and describe what it was like to sit in such a cramped, noisy, and often dangerous environment. Imagine opening a heavy hatch and descending through a narrow opening into the tank's interior. You are immediately struck by the claustrophobic space. Inside, it feels like being in a metal box where every inch is utilized. The seats are small and the crew is shoulder to shoulder. In combat positions, everyone has to take their places, the commander with their head in the hatch or at the periscope, the gunner pressed against the gun's sight, the loader twisted at the ammunition storage, and the driver half lying in their narrow space with pedals. Every movement is restricted. Inside the tank, one cannot stand up and often can't even stretch their legs. Some veterans recalled how the crew was crammed in like sardines. If someone among the soldiers was taller, they often bore bruises from banging into steel hatches. The noise inside the tank is a chapter unto itself. As soon as the engine roars, normal conversation practically disappears for the crew. Older tank models had no soundproofing. The engine was often separated from the fighting compartment only by a thin wall, if at all. While driving over rough terrain, everything made deafening noise. The tracks squeaked, the transmission howled, and metal plates reverberated. When the tank fired its cannon, the noise erupted inside like a cannon shot in a closed room. The shockwave could shake the insides and temporarily deafen even through ear protection. It is no wonder that many tank operators suffered hearing damage after the war. In their attempts to communicate amidst the noise, crews shouted or used an intercom, a telephone system in helmets that didn't always function reliably. An officer in one British tank humorously described the situation. "We shouted each other as if we were standing next to a starting airplane, and still, each person only understands half." Another enemy inside was the temperature and air quality. In the closed metal space, fresh air ran low, and during long drives, the interior turned into a stifling furnace. In summer, especially in the desert or during summer heat on the Eastern Front, temperatures inside the tank could easily exceed 40 degrees Celsius. The crew sweated in heavy coveralls, sweat dripped into their eyes, and soldiers suffered from dehydration. In such heat, attention and physical strength waned. Just a few hours in a scorching tank made a person feel as if they had worked all day in the sun. Conversely, in winter, the metal hull cooled down and it was piercingly cold inside, nearly as frigid as outside. The tank had no heating. If the engine wasn't running, the steel walls were cold to the touch. Soldiers inside wore gloves, thick coats, and hats. Clouds of steam came from their mouths, and their fingers froze while touching metal levers and cartridges. Although the engine provided some warmth while driving, it also meant having to blow warm air on their hands near the hot engine block at the back. The air was also filled with the smell of oil, gasoline, and sweat. After firing the cannon, the burning odor of gunpowder and cordite, the propellant charge of ammunition spread throughout the fighting compartment. If the tank didn't have a good ventilation system, and many early models didn't, smoke remained inside, irritating eyes and lungs. The loader had to quickly eject the empty shell casing out through the hatch to prevent further smoking inside. Nonetheless, tank operators often suffered from chronic coughing and irritated mucous membranes. Some tanks were fitted with small fans, but they could only partially reduce the exhaust fumes. Many soldiers resorted to clogging their noses with greasy oil or wearing simple masks to avoid fainting from the fumes during combat. Being inside the tank was also physically demanding. Constant jolts and impacts while driving over rough terrain literally shook the crew. Every hole or stone meant a soldier banged into the wall or metal equipment. Knees, elbows, and the helmets of the crew were marked with countless bruises and bumps over time. Therefore, tank operators' helmets were not made of steel like infantry, but were leather or fabric with padded linings. Their primary purpose was to protect the head from impacts inside the vehicle and muffle noise, while also housing communication headsets. Even so, injuries inside the tank were not uncommon. It only took a moment of inattention, and during a sudden stop, the loader could knock their brow on the edge of the hatch, or the driver could crush their fingers between the steering gear. Personal comfort was minimal. Those who needed to use the toilet were out of luck. During battle, there was no choice but to hold it, and during long transfers, improvisation was sometimes needed. For example, using an empty container or going over the edge of the turret if the situation allowed it. There was no privacy. The crew shared such moments stoically. It is no wonder that many tank operators preferred to sit on the tank's hull in the open air during quiet stretches of travel rather than cramped inside longer than necessary. But as soon as danger loomed, they had to crawl back inside, close the hatches, and rely on their steel shelter. Inside the tank, extreme conditions prevailed: heat, cold, noise, darkness, and smell. It was an environment that demanded resilient individuals. Yet crews managed to adapt and perform their tasks automatically, even in such discomfort. And it was in these confined conditions that tank operators had to deliver maximum performance when it came to combat. In the next chapter, we will see a dramatic description of a tank battle from the perspective of the crew. Moments when the cohesion of the team fully manifests itself while simultaneously facing the greatest danger. It is early morning, and the horizon is just beginning to brighten. The crew inside the tanks is already in position, nervously tense before the battle. The commander scans the horizon through the periscope. They clench the radio in hand, waiting for the order to attack. The driver has started the engine. Its rumble vibrates throughout the tank. The gunner and the loader do one last check to ensure that the main gun is loaded and ready. In such moments, just prior to combat, time seems to slow down. Each crew member focuses on their task while feeling their hearts race. Then it comes. The commander receives the signal and shouts into the intercom, "Forward!" The driver presses the pedal and the multi-ton colossus starts to move. The tracks squeal and the tank rushes forward. Soon distant gunfire erupts and flashes flicker in the periscope. The commander reports contact with the enemy and immediately directs the gunner. "Tank to the right, 800 meters, fire!" The gunner adjusts the sight until the silhouette of the enemy tank lines up in the crosshairs. The loader already has a round ready. Bam! The main gun fires and the entire tank shakes from the recoil. An empty shell casing clinks on the floor. The gunner catches sight of the enemy igniting in the distance. "Hit!" he reports, but the commander is already searching for another target. Combat inside the tank is utterly chaotic and intense. In the armored shell, the crew can see almost nothing. They rely on the commander's instructions, orienting themselves through narrow slits or periscopes for a small section of the surroundings. All around, explosions and gunfire erupt. At any moment, enemy projectiles strike the armor. The whole tank shudders with paint chips or dust peeling off inside. "Anti-tank gun on the left," warns the radio operator who spotted a flash. The driver instinctively steers the machine behind the nearest cover. Be it a terrain wave or the remains of a house, immediately a penetrating metallic sound echoes. The tank has been hit, this time only a ricochet. The shell skids off the sloped armor and does not penetrate it. Nonetheless, everyone inside feels it as a sharp jolt. "All right, we're moving on," shouts the commander to calm the crew. Minutes in combat seem endless. The crew works at full capacity. The loader sweats as he hurriedly loads rounds into the breech of the gun. Every second counts. The gunner strives to keep a cool head and aim accurately, even as adrenaline floods his body. The commander shifts focus between looking outside and communicating. He reports what is happening over the radio while giving orders to his crew. The driver grits his teeth and tries to maneuver the tank as cover as much as possible, weaving and avoiding becoming an easy target while also reacting to the commander's commands to stop or turn. The radio operator listens to the ether, receives new orders, and fires from the mounted machine gun at any enemy infantry that may be creeping in nearby trenches. In such combat, tank operators often do not perceive the broader picture of the battle. It is known that during the massive tank battle at Kursk in July 1943, where over 6,000 tanks clashed, individual crews had no idea they were part of such a grand encounter. They only saw a few enemy targets around them. They heard rumblings within a few hundred meters and focused all their attention on their own survival. Dozens of tanks could be burning in the distance, but the crew in one T-34 was aware only of the smoke, dust, and immediate threats. It was only later that they learned of the scale of the confrontation they had been part of. Throughout the fight, the quality of training and crew coordination became evident. Everyone had to know precisely what to do, even without orders. If the tank suddenly stopped, perhaps due to a malfunction or a track blown off by an explosion, the loader and gunner would not hesitate to jump outside and start repairing the track under fire, while the others covered the area with their machine guns. If the tank was hit and caught fire, seconds counted. The crew had to swiftly evacuate the machine through emergency hatches. Many tank operators practiced choreography for escaping to ensure they didn't become trapped in a panic. The psychologically hardest part was continuing to fight even when a neighboring tank exploded or a comrade reported over the radio that they had been hit. Crews developed a near-fatalist resilience. They focused on the mission, suppressing personal fear. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to function. A tank battle was an extremely intense experience, full of chaos and fear, but also of moments of victory and pride when they managed to hit the enemy or break through defenses. Many veterans later described how they acted almost automatically in combat and recalled real terror and horror only afterward, when the adrenaline subsided. In such moments, camaraderie was also fortified. The knowledge that they had collectively endured hell bonded crews for life. As soon as the fighting ceased, relief washed over them, but the aftermath soon surfaced. In the next section, we will discuss the darkest aspects of a tank operator's life, about fear, losses, and sacrifices. Every tank operator knew they served in one of the most dangerous weapons of World War II. They were hidden behind armor, but as the soldiers themselves said, the tank was often simultaneously a steel coffin. A single well-aimed enemy shot could turn a protective shell into a trap. Fear was a constant companion of the crews. Fear of armor-piercing shells, of anti-tank mines, of treacherous infantry with Panzerfausts lurking around corners. Many tank operators described that the worst part was the uncertainty. They never knew from where the blow that could kill them would come, yet they had to keep a cool head and follow orders. The greatest fear among all crews was fire. A burning tank turned in seconds into a furnace with no escape. Temperatures inside soared high enough that ammunition began to explode, filling the space with toxic smoke. If the hatch was not opened immediately or was damaged, the crew had no chance of escaping. Tragedies where an enemy shell struck the tank and ignited occurred on all fronts. Of the damaged American Shermans in Europe around mid-1944, it was reported that 2 out of every 3 would immediately catch fire. Even when later improvements were made in ammunition storage and fire safety measures implemented, some tanks could not escape the reputation of being burning torches. Among the Allies, there was dark humor that the Sherman would light up the first time, inspired by the famous Ronson lighter brand. Such nicknames, although exaggerated, reflected the real fear crews had of fire. The losses among tank operators were high. On the Eastern Front, tank units recorded horrifying statistics. The average lifespan of a tank in the battlefield could sometimes be counted only in weeks of intense combat, not days. The Soviet Union lost tens of thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns during the war. Each machine had 5 to 6 crew members, a significant portion of whom fell in battle. In the German Panzerwaffe, the losses of experienced crews also gradually grew, which was difficult to replace. Even in the Allies in the West, despite facing fewer enemies, they had to count their fallen tank soldiers in the thousands. For instance, the US Army lost over 6,000 tanks during the war, and each represented several lost lives or severe injuries. An enemy tank was not the only threat. Anti-tank guns hidden in bushes, mines laid on roads, air bombardment, these could all destroy a tank in an instant. For those who survived a hit, the hell often didn't end. Jumping out of a disabled tank was in itself risky. A soldier climbing out of the hatch could find themselves under enemy fire, waiting for the crew to flee. Tank operators often suffered burns, injuries from shrapnel, or fractures while trying to escape from a burning machine. Those who were seriously injured relied on the help of their comrades. There are poignant stories of crews that, even under fire, helped an injured comrade to safety or returned to a burning tank to pull out an unconscious fellow. Such solidarity was admirable, but it couldn't always prevent tragedy. The psychological pressure on tank operators was immense. Before every action, they knew that the chance of return might not be high. Many mentally counted the days they had already spent at the front and wondered how long they could still be lucky. The loss of a close comrade from the crew was deeply personal. Tank crews were very tightly bonded, and when someone fell, the others took it hard. However, the war marched on, and the tank had to go out again in a few days, perhaps already with a new member instead of the fallen one. Veterans agreed that the only thing that worked against paralyzing fear was routine and humor. The dark humor of tank operators knew no bounds. They joked that their uniforms, especially the black ones worn by Germans, were already prepared for a funeral. Or they painted small symbols on the turret for every survived battle, like a calendar of life. After the war, many tank operators suffered from post-traumatic stress. Memories of their tank being hit, fire raging inside, or hearing the screams of injured comrades in the neighboring machine haunted them in nightmares. Some couldn't shake off claustrophobia for a long time. Years spent in tight spaces left psychological scars. Others spoke of enduring tinnitus, that is, ringing in the ears, or chronic back pain from vibrations and impacts. The dark side of serving in tanks was redeemed by the significant contribution tank operators made to victory. They were the ones who broke through enemy lines, destroyed fortified positions, and inspired courage in other components of the army. However, the price they paid was high. Fortunately, the war didn't last forever, and those who survived witnessed its end. Before we say goodbye to the story of wartime tank operators, let us take a moment to see how different their experiences were in different parts of the world and how they managed to adapt to extreme conditions. The conditions in which tank operators fought varied significantly depending on the deployment location. Each battlefield presented unique challenges, and crews had to be resourceful to prevail. The desolate sandy desert of North Africa, for example, meant enormous heat during the day and surprisingly cool nights for British, German, and Italian tank operators. At noon, the sun heated the armor to the point that eggs could literally be fried on it. Crews thus often rested in the shade of their tanks during the heat of the day, if the situation allowed, and advanced into combat early in the morning or in the evening when it was less hot. Additionally, fine desert sand penetrated everywhere. It clogged the engine air filters, grated on moving parts of weapons, and got into soldiers' eyes, ears, and mouths. Mechanics had to clean engines daily, and crews wrapped their faces in cloths to ward off dust. In British tanks, improvised sand shields, fabric covers, and metal plates attached around the engine intakes proved effective for capturing at least some of the dust. The German Afrika Korps adopted the habit of wearing protective goggles and canvas overalls that could be relatively easily shaken free of sand. In such heat, water was more precious than ammunition. Every tank carried a supply of water canisters for the crew and engine cooling. British and Australian tank operators in Africa became famous for not only carrying water but also tea, and it wasn't uncommon to hear that soldiers stopped in the middle of the desert to brew tea at 5 o'clock. Even with war raging around them, morale often ran hand in hand with small rituals that reminded them of home. On the opposite end of the climate spectrum stood the Eastern Front in winter. Russian frosts in 1941 to 1942 became a nightmare for German tank units, which were not initially equipped for such extreme conditions. Oil in engines thickened, batteries lost capacity, and water in radiators froze. Tanks parked overnight on windy plains simply wouldn't start in the morning unless special care was provided. Therefore, tank operators often left their engines running overnight in winter. They preferred to sacrifice precious fuel rather than risk their machine freezing and being unable to start in the morning. Another method was to warm the engine every 2 hours or drain the water from it and store it in a warm place such as a tent, then pour it back into the radiator in the morning. These exhausting procedures were necessary for the tanks to function at all. Soviet tanks had the advantage of diesel. The diesel engines of T-34s handled the frost somewhat better than the gasoline engines of German machines. Nonetheless, even Soviet tank operators suffered. In freezing temperatures, steel tracks and metal parts cracked under tension. Tanks sometimes had to be literally covered with tarps and buried in snow at night, like insulation. Crews warmed up by cooking soup right inside the tank on portable stoves or huddled around kerosene heaters in their tents. Each morning included a ritual of getting the machine operational, sometimes at the cost of improvisation. There are known cases where soldiers lit small fires under the engine, very carefully so as not to set the entire tank ablaze, to warm the oil pan before starting. Another extreme was muddy terrain and rain. In spring and fall, the Eastern Front and Western Europe turned into seas of mud. The phenomenon known as Rasputitsa in the Soviet Union meant that unpaved roads became impassable. Wheels and tracks sank deep into the slushy ground. Tanks bogged down in mud became easy targets, and extricating them was an enormous effort. Crews tried to place wooden logs or boards under tracks, shoveled mud away with shovels, but often had to wait for the ground to dry out a bit. Soldiers commonly walked through mud to relieve a stuck tank's burden. These situations were frustrating and exhausting. They couldn't fight and only prayed that no one would discover them in the meantime. In Western Europe, tank operators faced a specific problem known as bocage in Normandy. The landscape, filled with smaller fields bordered by tall hedgerows, so-called hedge roses, hindered the free movement of tanks following the Allied landings in France. Some American units invented an improvised bushcutter during this time. They attached teeth made from welded beams to the fronts of their Shermans, capable of tearing through and breaching dense hedgerows. This adaptation allowed tanks to push through obstacles and surprise the enemy. Another battlefield adaptation was added armor and protective features. As new threats emerged, such as handheld anti-tank weapons like Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck in the hands of German infantry toward the end of the war, Soviet tank operators began to respond in their way. They secured metal grids or nets known as Schürzen around their T-34s, although the term originally referred to skirts on tanks in German usage. These were intended to prematurely detonate cumulative shells and reduce the chance of penetrating the main armor. Soldiers in the field didn't hesitate to enhance their tank's protection with whatever was at hand. Sandbags, spare track links, wheels from the chassis, or even cavities filled with concrete on the tank. In the battlefields of the Pacific and the Far East, tanks were deployed less frequently, but crews all faced singular hardships. In the jungles of Burma or on the islands of the Pacific, dense vegetation obstructed tank movement, and visibility was minimal. Tanks had to stick to roads or literally carve their way through, making them vulnerable. Japanese anti-tank tactics often involved close-range strikes. Soldiers would dive under tracks with explosives or utilize anti-tank rifles and cannons from concealed positions. Allied tank operators in these areas had to contend with tropical climates. Humidity and mold damaged electronics and ammunition. Insects invaded the tiniest corners of the tank, and the engine room overheated just like in the desert. Whether it was the sandy Sahara, European meadows, muddy fields in Ukraine, or frozen plains in Leningrad, tank operators demonstrated a capacity for improvisation and resilience. They constantly had to improve their techniques and tactics to adapt to the environment. These experiences weren't forgotten. Many improvements initiated by soldiers in the field later reflected in the design of new tanks and in manuals for subsequent generations. Now that we have covered the main chapters of a tank operator's life during the war, we can consider the legacy these armored knights left behind and what we can take from their stories today. The fates of tank operators in World War II embody immense courage, determination, and tragedy. These soldiers risked their lives daily within steel giants that represented the pinnacle of military technology of their time. Their experiences didn't vanish with the end of the war. Instead, they influenced the further development of tanks and training for crews worldwide. Many veterans participated in training new tank operators after the war, passing on valuable insights. How critical is teamwork within the crew? How vital is technical maintenance? Or, for example, how morale among soldiers is often sustained through small rituals and a sense of belonging. Modern tanks are incomparably more advanced and safer than their World War II predecessors. They have stronger armor, sophisticated targeting systems, air conditioning, and even built-in kettle systems for the crew. Such adaptations were initiated by the British based on experiences where soldiers had to exit and brew tea during combat. Nevertheless, even today's tank operators don't have a comfortable life. They still operate in confined spaces. They must deal with the pressure of combat and rely on one another. When we watch contemporary footage of tanks in action, whether in exercises or unfortunately in armed conflicts of the 21st century, we can see echoes of the stories of their predecessors. The basic principles remain: resilient technology, well-coordinated crews, and the need for constant improvisation in the face of unexpected situations. Today, more than 80 years later, only a handful of veterans, former tank operators, remain alive, but their memories persist as tremendously valuable testimonies for future generations. Their stories serve as a memento of the destructive power of war.